The frantic knocking on my door dragged me from a deep sleep, the sound echoing through the quiet Saturday morning like an alarm bell. My husband David was already half out of bed, a grim expression on his face. Before I could even ask, he looked at me, his eyes wide with a strange mix of shock and morbid curiosity. "It's Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a hushed whisper. "Something's happened." I stumbled to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. The flashing blue and red lights painted our usually serene suburban street in an eerie, pulsing glow. An ambulance, a fire truck, and 2 police cruisers crowded the curb in front of the small, perfectly manicured house next door. My heart gave a small, uncomfortable lurch. Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor, the woman I'd exchanged polite good mornings with for 15 years, was clearly at the center of this commotion. My initial reaction was a cold, clinical curiosity, a detached observation. But what I didn't know then, standing there on her immaculate front porch just minutes later, watching the paramedics load a body bag into the ambulance, was that her death would unravel not just her secrets, but expose a gaping, unforgivable hole in my own humanity. The morning air hung heavy with unspoken questions and the metallic scent of emergency vehicles. Other neighbors, drawn by the sirens, had started to trickle out, forming small, hushed clusters on their lawns. Each face held the same morbid fascination, the same unspoken verdict: Mrs. Gable was gone. Just like that, the quiet, almost invisible fixture of our street had become its most dramatic spectacle. I stood beside David, my arms wrapped around myself. Not out of cold, but a sudden, uncomfortable chill. Mrs. Gable had been a constant for as long as we'd lived here. Every morning she'd be out on her porch, tending to her vibrant petunias, offering a small, dignified nod as I left for work. Every evening, as I pulled into my driveway, she'd be silhouetted against her living room window, a cup of tea in her hand. We never exchanged more than a few words, a pleasantry here, a comment on the weather there. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," I'd say. "Lovely day, isn't it?" She'd reply, her voice always soft, almost ethereal. That was the extent of our relationship, a carefully maintained, unspoken boundary of neighborly politeness. The police officer, a young man with a tired face, approached us. "Are you her next of kin?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the small gathering. We all shook our heads, a collective affirmation of Mrs. Gable's apparent solitude. "No, officer," I replied, stepping forward slightly. "We're just neighbors." "She lived alone." The officer nodded, his pen poised over his notepad. "Did she have any family you know of? Any children, relatives?" His questions hung in the air, each one a stark reminder of how little we truly knew about the woman who lived just a few feet away. I racked my brain, searching for any scrap of information, any whispered anecdote, but came up empty. I don't think so," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "We never saw anyone visit her. She was very private." That word, private, felt like a shield I'd always held up, an easy excuse for my own lack of deeper engagement. It was easier to respect her privacy than to truly connect. Easier to assume she preferred her solitude than to wonder if she longed for company. David placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, but I could feel the tremor in my own. A flicker of guilt, small but insistent, began to stir within me. The ambulance finally pulled away, its siren silent, leaving an unnerving quiet in its wake. The police officers began to pack up, their official presence fading. The neighbors, having witnessed the finality of it all, slowly dispersed back into their homes, leaving behind an emptied space and a lingering sense of melancholy. David and I lingered, watching the last patrol car disappear around the bend. "What do you think happened?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I admitted, my gaze fixed on Mrs. Gable's now empty house. "She was old. Probably just passed away in her sleep." It was the most logical, most comforting explanation. A peaceful end for a peaceful woman. But even as I said it, a part of me felt a vague disquiet. How long had she been in there alone? Who would have known? Who should have known? For the next few days, Mrs. Gable's house stood silent, a vacant sentinel on our street. The mail piled up, newspapers remained tucked into the front porch railing. A small, almost imperceptible film of dust seemed to settle over everything, signaling an absence that suddenly felt profound. It was a visible wound in the otherwise seamless fabric of our neighborhood. Then, a few days later, a notice appeared on her front door, an official-looking document taped with a cold finality. It stated that due to no immediate next of kin being found, the local authorities would be securing the property. David and I discussed it over dinner, a strange mixture of concern and detachment in our voices. "It's sad, really," he murmured, swirling his wine. "To have lived a whole life and have no one to claim you." "I know," I replied, picking at my food. But she always seemed content, self-sufficient. I tried to quell the growing unease in my stomach. Was that true? Or was it just another convenient narrative I'd constructed? The next day, a social worker, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, knocked on my door. She explained the situation. "We've tried exhaustive searches for any family members," she said, her voice gentle. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Gable's records are sparse. No emergency contacts, no will filed." My heart sank. This woman had truly been alone. "We need someone to help us go through her belongings," Sarah continued, her eyes searching mine. "To look for any personal papers, a hidden will, anything that might give us a clue about her wishes or possible family. Since you're her closest neighbor, we were hoping you might be willing to assist. It's usually quicker if someone familiar with the household or the person can help identify important items." I hesitated. Entering Mrs. Gable's house, her sanctuary, felt like an intrusion, a violation of the very privacy I'd always respected. Yet, the thought of strangers, officials, sifting through her life felt even worse. A wave of obligation mixed with a deeper, unidentifiable sense of responsibility washed over me. Of course, I heard myself say, "I'll help in any way I can." The next afternoon, armed with a sense of purpose and a heavy heart, I stood on Mrs. Gable's porch, a set of newly cut keys in my hand. The lock clicked, a surprisingly loud sound in the absolute silence. I pushed the door open and a scent, subtle but distinct, enveloped me. It wasn't the smell of decay, but something far more poignant: dried potpourri, old books, a faint hint of lavender, and an underlying scent of pure, undisturbed air. It was the scent of a life lived quietly, immaculately. The entryway was small, but every detail was meticulously arranged. A small antique table held a ceramic bowl filled with dried flowers. A coat rack, empty save for a single well-worn cardigan, stood by the door. I took a deep breath, the air cool and still, as if holding its breath along with me. This was the first time I had ever been inside Mrs. Gable's home in 15 years. The only time I'd ever even seen the inside was through her windows from afar, always fleeting glimpses of a spotless, orderly existence. The living room was exactly as I'd imagined, pristine. Every cushion plumped, every surface gleaming. A collection of delicate porcelain figurines sat on a mantelpiece, each one perfectly aligned. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, the only sign that time had continued its relentless march in this suspended world. There was no clutter, no mess, nothing to suggest a life lived with abandon or even minor chaos. It was a snapshot of perfect order, preserved. Sarah, the social worker, met me there, offering a sympathetic smile. "Thank you so much for doing this, Mary," she said, indicating the tasks. "We just need to check for any legal documents, a will, bank statements, anything that might clarify her estate. If you find anything personal, you can set it aside for now. We can try to locate distant relatives later." We started in the living room, methodically going through drawers, checking under sofa cushions, scanning bookshelves. I found a collection of classic novels, their pages crisp and unread, as if they were for display rather than for reading. There was an album of faded landscape photographs, but no faces, no people. It was an inventory of a life lived without much visible human connection. As I moved into what appeared to be her study, a small room off the living room, filled with a neat writing desk and more bookshelves, I began to feel a deeper pang of unease. This wasn't just a house. It was an archive of a woman I had fundamentally misunderstood. I had always assumed her silence meant she preferred to be alone, that her perfectly maintained house was a reflection of a perfectly contented inner world. Now, I began to wonder if it was a fortress meticulously constructed to keep the world and me at a safe distance. I ran my hand over the smooth, polished surface of her writing desk. On it, a single antique fountain pen rested beside a small, leather-bound notebook. It was unassuming dark brown with a faint gold embossed pattern on its cover. My fingers brushed against its spine, a subtle ripple of curiosity sparking through me. This was different from the bills and receipts we were looking for. This felt personal. Anything in here? Sarah called from the kitchen, where she was meticulously checking cupboards. Just some books and a desk, I called back, my voice feeling strangely loud in the quiet room. My gaze lingered on the notebook. My instructions were to look for legal documents. This wasn't a legal document. It felt like trespassing to even consider opening it. But an undeniable pull, a magnetic force, drew my hand towards it. This woman had been my neighbor for 15 years, a woman I said good morning to every day. Did I not owe her this much to understand anything about the life she had kept so perfectly hidden? My conscience wrestled with my curiosity. On one hand, invading her private thoughts felt wrong, disrespectful to the very privacy I'd used as an excuse for my distance. On the other, the desperate lack of information, the image of her body being taken away by strangers, compelled me. Perhaps this notebook held the key to her past, to a lost relative, a friend, someone who should know about her passing. I picked it up, the leather cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. It felt surprisingly light, yet heavy with potential secrets. I turned it over in my hands, noting the delicate wear on its corners, suggesting it had been handled often. It wasn't a pristine, untouched object, but a beloved companion. Taking a deep breath, I rationalized. This wasn't for gossip. This was about responsibility. About uncovering a life that seemed to have vanished without a trace. This was for Mrs. Gable. I told myself that. I opened the notebook, the pages a soft, creamy beige. The script inside was elegant, flowing, clearly penned with the very fountain pen resting beside it. It was dated, a series of entries spanning years, starting almost 20 years ago. My eyes scanned the first entry, a small tremor running through me as I deciphered the delicate cursive. November 14th, 20X. Today, the new neighbors moved in next door. A young couple, Mary and David. They seem lovely. I hope they'll be happy here. My breath hitched. My own name. My husband's name. The date was exactly 15 years ago, the day we moved into our home. My hands began to tremble, and a cold dread spread through my chest. This wasn't a random collection of thoughts. This was about me. Or, at least, about us. And that simple, hopeful sentence, penned with such innocence, felt like a judgment. An indictment of every good morning and lovely day I had ever offered. I flipped to the next page, then the next, a frantic urgency taking hold. Each entry, dated and meticulously written, chronicled the small, mundane observations of my life, our life, from next door. The way I tended my garden, the laughter of my children in the backyard, David's car pulling out each morning. It wasn't stalker-like, not malicious. It was an observation, a quiet, unwavering gaze. May 2nd, 20XX. Mary planted new roses today. They're a beautiful shade of crimson. She works so diligently. A dedicated gardener, just like my mother was. My eyes burned. A dedicated gardener. She saw that. She saw me. But what did I see? A reclusive old woman, a pleasant background character in my busy life. I had never noticed her noticing me. I had never paused to truly see her. The intricate porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece, the carefully arranged dried flowers, the pristine, untouched books. They weren't just decorative items in a private fortress. They were fragments of a life she silently shared, a life I had been too self-absorbed, too indifferent to notice. A new wave of nausea washed over me, far more profound than the initial dread. It was shame, burning and corrosive. The polite greetings, the casual waves, they had been my bare minimum, my obligation. But for Mrs. Gable, they seemed to have been something more. Something she recorded. Something she cherished in her own silent way. I continued to read, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The entries weren't just observations. They were filled with reflections, small insights, even gentle anxieties. And beneath it all, a current of profound loneliness, woven into the fabric of everyday occurrences. My children's birthdays, their milestones, our family barbecues, all recorded, sometimes with a wistful note. July 18th, 20X. The little one, Emily, turned 5 today. Her laughter carries so clearly over the fence. Reminds me of simpler times of children running free. Such a blessing. Blessing. That word, so innocently penned, twisted a knife in my gut. While my daughter's laughter filled our yard, bringing joy to my family, it also echoed through Mrs. Gable's quiet home, a stark reminder of what she perhaps didn't have. And I, the very source of that sound, had never once thought to invite her over, to share a piece of that joy. I had built a wall of privacy around her, when perhaps what she truly needed was an open door. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. 15 years. 15 years of polite nods and superficial exchanges. 15 years where a rich, observant, and seemingly lonely life unfolded right next to mine, and I had been utterly blind. How could I have been so ignorant? So wrapped up in my own world, so dismissive of hers? My fingers traced the delicate handwriting on the page, each word a testament to a connection I had unknowingly, selfishly squandered. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a window into a soul, a quiet testament to a life lived on the fringes, observed from a distance I had helped create. And as I turned the page, my eyes falling on an entry dated only a few weeks prior, the words blurred through a fresh flood of tears, a devastating revelation began to unfold, shaking me to my very core. My fingers traced the delicate handwriting on the page, each word a testament to a connection I had unknowingly, selfishly squandered. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a window into a soul, a quiet testament to a life lived on the fringes, observed from a distance I had helped create. And as I turned the page, my eyes falling on an entry dated only a few weeks prior, the words blurred through a fresh flood of tears, a devastating revelation began to unfold, shaking me to my very core. September 28th, 20x. The pain in my chest grows. I wonder if Mary will ever know. She looks so much like her father at that age, my Robert. My beautiful, stubborn Robert. I wish I could tell her, my granddaughter, how much I love her, how much I regret. But some wounds never heal. And her mother, she would never allow it. The notebook slipped from my trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the polished wood floor. My Robert, my granddaughter. The words echoed in the silent room, each syllable striking me like a physical blow. Mrs. Gable, my neighbor. The quiet woman with the petunias. She was my grandmother, Eleanor Gable, my father's mother. The woman I had been told died before I was old enough to remember her, a casualty of some vague, unspecified illness. The woman whose memory my father always spoke of with a distant sadness, never offering details. A dizzying wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back, my hand grasping the edge of the writing desk for support. The room, which moments ago had felt impeccably ordered, now seemed to spin, its pristine surfaces mocking the chaos erupting within me. 15 years. 15 years I had lived next door to my own grandmother, exchanging polite, meaningless pleasantries, never knowing that the lonely gaze from her living room window, the wistful notes about my children, the quiet observations of my daily life, were from a woman yearning to connect, a woman who held a secret so profound it redefined my entire existence. My father, Robert. His mother, Eleanor. My grandmother. And my mother, she would never allow it. The phrase seared into my brain, a searing indictment of the woman who raised me, of the family narrative I had always accepted without question. My parents had lied to me. Not a small white lie, but a monumental, cruel deception that had stolen 15 years of a relationship, erased a living, breathing person from my family tree. If you've ever felt the ground beneath you crumble, realizing a fundamental truth about your past was a carefully constructed lie, then you'll understand the seismic shift that occurred within me. The shame I felt for my indifference towards Mrs. Gable curdled into a bitter, burning rage, rage at my parents, rage at the deceit, rage at myself for my own blind acceptance. The gaping, unforgivable hole in my own humanity suddenly widened, becoming a chasm that had swallowed an entire branch of my family. I sank to the floor, my legs no longer able to support me, and retrieved the notebook. My hands shook as I flipped back through the pages, searching frantically for any other mention, any confirmation, any clue that I hadn't simply imagined it. There were dates, specific details, small anecdotes about my father's childhood, snippets that only a mother would know. August 12th, 1968. Robert scraped his knee today, falling from the oak tree. The same one that stands in their backyard now. He was always so fearless, even then. The oak tree in my backyard. The very tree my children had climbed countless times. This house. Her house. Had she chosen this specific house on this specific street to be close to what she had lost or what she had been denied? The meticulous care of her home, the careful observations, it wasn't just a reflection of a private person. It was the desperate effort of a woman clinging to the only connection she dared to have with her family. A faint sound from the kitchen startled me. Sarah, the social worker. I quickly, almost instinctively, snapped the notebook shut and tucked it beneath a stack of old magazines on the desk. My heart was still racing, but a fierce, protective instinct had kicked in. This was my grandmother. These were my family's secrets. I wasn't ready to share this with anyone, especially not yet. I needed to understand. I needed to confront. Find anything interesting in there. Sarah's voice was gentle as she appeared in the doorway, a stack of utility bills in her hand. I forced a shaky smile. Just some old correspondence I managed, my voice a little hoarse. And a lot of books. No will, no legal documents, not yet anyway. Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed slightly. Well, we'll keep looking. It's unusual for someone to have absolutely no paperwork. She glanced around the perfectly ordered study. She certainly kept a tidy house. No clutter to speak of. No clutter, I thought, but a lifetime of secrets hidden in plain sight. We spent another hour methodically searching, my mind reeling, my focus scattered. Every untouched item, every carefully placed photograph, every unread book felt like a scream of unspoken pain. I imagined her, my own grandmother, watching me from her window as I tended my roses, as I laughed with my children in the very yard where my father had scraped his knee. The casual good mornings now felt like an unbearable weight, a profound act of unintentional cruelty. How many times had she longed to reach out, to reveal herself? How many times had she held back, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear of rejection, perhaps because of my mother's implicit threat? When Sarah finally said it was enough for the day, I practically fled the house. The quiet was no longer comforting. It was suffocating, filled with the ghosts of unspoken truths. I walked across the manicured lawn, the short distance to my own home now feeling like an impossibly vast canyon. The blue and red lights of the emergency vehicles were long gone, but the eerie glow now seemed to emanate from within me, from the burning core of my shattered perception. David met me at the door, a worried expression on his face. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I couldn't hold it in. Not from him. Not from the man who had shared this life with me, unknowingly living next door to my hidden kin. Worse, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. Much, much worse. I led him to the kitchen, my mind still racing. How to even begin? I pulled out Mrs. Gable's notebook from my bag, the small leather-bound book that now felt like a ticking time bomb. David, I said, pushing it across the counter. Read this. Just read the last entry. He picked it up, his brow furrowed with curiosity, then confusion, then an expression of dawning horror as his eyes scanned the delicate script. His gaze shot up to mine, wide and disbelieving. Mary, what is this? My granddaughter? Robert. She was my grandmother, David, I choked out, the tears finally spilling over. Eleanor, my father's mother. The one they told me died when I was a baby. David sat heavily at the kitchen table, running a hand through his hair. But how? She lived right next door. For 15 years. Your own grandmother? His voice was a blend of shock and disbelief. This is insane. I know. I sobbed. I know. My parents lied to me. To us. They let her live alone, right here, and never told me a thing. My mother, especially. The notebook says her mother. She would never allow it. A heavy silence descended, broken only by my ragged breathing. David was trying to process it. The sheer magnitude of the deception. But why, Mary? Why would they do something like that? I don't know, I cried, shaking my head. But I'm going to find out. I have to. I have to know why my own family would keep me from my grandmother for my entire life. The phone in my hand felt impossibly heavy. My mother's number, dialed countless times over the years for mundane updates, now felt like a direct line to a fundamental untruth. I took a deep, fortifying breath, bracing myself for the storm. David sat beside me, his hand resting supportively on my arm. "Hello, sweetie," my mother's cheerful voice answered, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in my world. "Everything okay? You sound a little off." "Mom," I began, my voice trembling. "I need to ask you something. Something very important." "Oh, what is it, dear? Is everything all right with the kids?" "It's about Mrs. Gable," I said, cutting to the chase, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Our neighbor. She passed away last week. I was helping the social worker go through her house today." A beat of silence. A pause that stretched, thick with unspoken knowledge. "Oh, yes, your father mentioned that," my mother finally said, her tone suddenly flat, devoid of its earlier cheer. "Such a shame. An old woman alone." "She wasn't just an old woman alone, Mom," I stated, my voice hardening. "She was Eleanor. Eleanor Gable, my grandmother." Another longer silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the frantic scramble for an explanation, a plausible denial. "Mary, what are you talking about? Your grandmother Eleanor passed away decades ago. You were a baby." "Don't lie to me, Mom," I said, my voice rising. "I found her journal. She wrote about me, about David, about Robert. My father. She called him my Robert. She called me my granddaughter. She was living next door to us for 15 years, and you and Dad lied to me all this time." The facade crumbled. I heard a sharp intake of breath, a choked sound from the other end of the line. "Mary, please," my mother pleaded, her voice now raw, stripped of its usual composed timbre. "It's not that simple. There are things you don't understand. Things your father. He never wanted you to know? Then tell me now, Mom." I demanded, my anger flaring. "Tell me everything. Why? Why would you do this? Why would you keep me from her? What could possibly be so important that you would erase my grandmother from my life and let her die alone next door, a stranger?" My mother let out a shuddering sigh, a sound of defeat. "It wasn't my decision, Mary. Not entirely. Your father, he had his reasons. Deep, painful reasons. Eleanor. She wasn't an easy woman. There was a lot of heartbreak, a lot of resentment." "Resentment for what?" I pressed, my heart aching with a fresh wave of grief, not just for Mrs. Gable, but for the childhood memories I'd been denied. "What could be so bad that you let her live next door for 15 years, watching her own granddaughter without ever acknowledging her?" "It's complicated," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible now. "It started long before you were born. With your father's brother, my brother-in-law, your Uncle Thomas. He disappeared. And Eleanor, she blamed your father for everything." My Uncle Thomas. I had heard his name only in hushed tones, usually by older relatives, always followed by a quick change of subject. He was the ghost in our family, the relative no one spoke of, presumed long dead or estranged. Another missing piece of my family history, conveniently swept under the rug. My head throbbed. This wasn't just about my grandmother. It was a tangled web reaching back generations. "What does Uncle Thomas have to do with this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, a chilling premonition settling over me. "What did Eleanor blame Dad for?" A long pause, filled with the static of the phone line, and the even heavier static of unspoken family trauma. Then my mother's voice, fragile, almost breaking. She said your father knew more than he let on about Thomas's disappearance. She said he abandoned him. And that that he owed her something. Something that she spent her entire life trying to reclaim. My father, the steady, reliable man I knew, abandoning his own brother? And Mrs. Gable, my grandmother, spending her life trying to reclaim something related to this disappearance? This was far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just an estrangement. It was a deep, festering wound, a decades-old secret that had led my grandmother to live a silent, solitary life just feet away from me. "Reclaim what, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, a cold dread gripping my stomach. What did Thomas owe her? What did my father do? My mother sighed again, a sound of profound weariness. Mary, I can't tell you everything over the phone. You need to come home. Your father, he's not well. And this whole thing with Eleanor, it's bringing it all back. He needs to tell you himself what he did, and what Eleanor believed she was owed. But it's not what you think. It's not what any of us thought. It's not what any of us thought. Those words hung in the air, a chilling harbinger of truths yet to be unearthed. My father was not well. This whole thing with Eleanor was bringing it all back. The web was growing darker, wider, encompassing more than just a forgotten grandmother. It spoke of a profound family betrayal, a hidden past, and an obligation or a secret. That might define not just Mrs. Gable's life, but mine too. And as the phone clicked and the silence descended once more, I knew with a terrifying certainty that my quiet suburban life was about to be irrevocably shattered by the ghosts of a history I never knew existed. A history that Mrs. Gable had silently, patiently waited for me to discover. My grandmother's death was not an end, but a terrifying beginning to my family's buried truths. The journal was just the first layer. I had a feeling the real story, the one my parents had meticulously buried, was far more devastating than a simple estrangement, and that Mrs. Gable's silent vigil next door had been about something much darker than just a longing for family. The phone clicked, and the silence that descended was not the familiar quiet of our suburban home, but a cavernous void echoing with unheard stories and unasked questions. David looked at me, his face a mixture of concern and bewilderment. So Uncle Thomas, and a blame game? What does that even mean? I don't know, I whispered, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. But it's big, David, bigger than I ever imagined. My father, my mother, they've been carrying this for decades. And Eleanor, my grandmother, she lived and died next door, silently carrying it with them. The sheer magnitude of the deception, the layers of buried trauma, felt like a physical weight in the air. The drive to my parents' house the next day was shrouded in a thick tension. The familiar route, usually a comforting passage, now felt like a journey into a storm. David, bless his steady heart, drove in silence, occasionally reaching for my hand, his presence a grounding force against the whirlwind in my mind. Every passing landmark, every tree, seemed to mock my blissful ignorance. How many times had I made this drive, oblivious to the living history literally in my backyard? My parents lived in a charming, albeit slightly outdated, colonial house on the outskirts of town. It was the house I grew up in, a place synonymous with safety and unconditional love. Now it felt like a stage where a long-running, painful play was about to reach its final, devastating act. My mother met us at the door, her face pale and drawn, her usual polished demeanor replaced by a fragile vulnerability. She hugged me tightly, a desperate, almost suffocating embrace, as if trying to shield me from the very truths she was about to reveal. My father, Robert, sat in his favorite armchair in the living room, a blanket draped over his knees despite the warmth of the room. He looked smaller, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ornate fireplace anywhere but at me. The not well my mother had mentioned on the phone was visible, not just in his physical frailty, but in the profound weariness etched onto his face. He seemed to have aged a decade overnight. The air in the living room was thick with unspoken history. The porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece, the family photos lining the walls, the very wallpaper seemed to hum with suppressed memories. It was an interrogation room disguised as a family den. Mary, David, my mother began, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes darting between my father and me. Your father, he wants to tell you himself. He feels awful. I sat opposite my father, Eleanor's journal clutched in my lap, its worn leather a tangible link to the truth. Dad, I said, my voice steady, surprising myself. Mom said Eleanor was my grandmother, and that something happened with Uncle Thomas. That she blamed you. My father finally looked up, his eyes, so much like mine, filled with a deep, bottomless sadness. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound. Eleanor, she was always a strong woman. Fiercely proud. And fiercely protective of Thomas. He paused, as if gathering the strength to excavate long-buried stones. Thomas, my younger brother. He was brilliant. An artist. A dreamer. But he was also fragile. He struggled with depression even then when nobody really talked about it. A new layer of understanding began to form. Uncle Thomas wasn't just a ghost. He was a person battling an invisible illness in an era that offered little support. Our mother Eleanor came from a wealthy family. My father continued, his voice growing stronger, a narrative taking hold. The Gable family. They had an estate, a large sum of money held in trust, meant for the firstborn male grandchild. Thomas was that grandchild. But there was a condition. He had to be of sound mind and body to inherit it at 25. My father swallowed hard, his gaze distant. Thomas was approaching 25. He was painting, but he was also withdrawing. He'd have periods of intense melancholy. Our mother Eleanor, she was convinced the family lawyer, a strict man, would deem Thomas unfit, and the inheritance would pass to the next male heir. A cold dread seeped into my veins. The firstborn male grandchild. The inheritance. The pressure. Eleanor was desperate for Thomas to get that money, he confessed, his voice laced with a bitter self-reproach. She saw it as his due, his chance to be recognized, to protect him. She wanted me to lie, to vouch for Thomas's soundness, even when he was clearly struggling. She thought I, as his older brother, could convince the lawyer, persuade Thomas to put on a front. And you didn't, I stated, not a question, but a dawning realization. My father shook his head slowly, his eyes brimming. I couldn't. Not honestly. I loved Thomas, Mary. I wanted him to get better. But I knew the money, the pressure would destroy him if he wasn't stable. I told Eleanor he needed help, not a fortune he couldn't handle. We had a terrible fight. The worst. I told her I wouldn't lie for him. That he needed real care, not just money. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by my father's shallow breaths. My mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. The next day, my father continued, his voice barely audible. Thomas was gone. He left a note. Said he couldn't face the family's expectations. Couldn't live with the pressure or with my betrayal. He said I had abandoned him. That I had chosen the inheritance over him. That I'd let the family down, let him down. He looked at me then, his eyes pleading for understanding. Eleanor found the note. She never forgave me. She believed I had driven Thomas away, that I had stolen his future, perhaps even his life. The trust fund, indeed, eventually passed to me after Thomas was declared legally deceased 7 years later. But I never touched a penny of it. It's all still in a separate account, waiting. Waiting for I don't know what. My mind reeled. This wasn't a simple estrangement. This was a tragedy, a family torn apart by mental illness, inheritance, and the impossible choices of loyalty and truth. Eleanor hadn't just lost a son. She had lost her belief in her other son, my father. She had seen him as the instrument of Thomas's disappearance, the one who denied Thomas his rightful legacy, and in her grief and anger, she had condemned him. And so, my mother picked up the thread, her voice trembling. Eleanor cut Robert out of her life. She moved away, changed her name briefly, then moved back to this very town, but always kept a distance. She refused to acknowledge Robert, not as her son, not as your father. She said he had died to her the day Thomas disappeared. But then, why move next door to us? I asked, the raw wound of her journal entries throbbing in my chest. Us? Why live a secret life for 15 years? My father sighed, a deep, shuddering breath. She saw you, Mary, you and David, your children. She saw the new neighbors. She found out it was us, she said. She said she wanted to be close to the only remaining piece of Thomas, that you reminded her of him, his kindness, his spirit. And that you, her granddaughter, were the only person she might ever be able to reclaim from the wreckage of our family. That the inheritance, the money, was only ever meant to secure Thomas's happiness, and she felt cheated out of that chance. She wanted to reclaim a connection, a sense of family, through you, without ever having to acknowledge me. The reclaiming wasn't about money. It was about love, connection, and a desperate attempt to mend a broken lineage through me. My grandmother, Eleanor, had lived a life of silent vigil, a ghost in plain sight, hoping to connect with her granddaughter while simultaneously punishing her son for a perceived betrayal that stemmed from a deeper, more complicated tragedy. My mother continued, her voice softer now. When you moved in, Robert tried to reach out. He wrote her letters, left them on her porch, but she always left them unopened or returned them. She wouldn't even acknowledge his existence, let alone forgive him. She only ever sent back one thing. A drawing. One of Thomas's early sketches of a young boy clinging to an oak tree. The oak tree in my backyard. The symbol of my father's childhood, Thomas's daring spirit, and the very ground where my father had scraped his knee and where, perhaps, a critical conversation or confrontation had taken place. It was a silent witness to their fractured past, and now to my unearthed present. We knew, my mother confessed, tears streaming down her face. We saw her out there, tending her garden, watching you. It broke our hearts. But she had made it clear. She wanted nothing to do with Robert, and we didn't want to bring that pain, that bitterness, into your life, into your children's lives. We thought we were protecting you by keeping the secret, by allowing her to live her quiet life next door without forcing a confrontation that would only reopen old wounds for everyone. The rage I had felt earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a profound and aching sorrow. Not for myself, not just for the lost years with my grandmother, but for all of them. For Eleanor, who had carried such immense grief and resentment that it consumed her life. For Thomas, lost to an illness the family couldn't comprehend. For my father, who bore the weight of his brother's disappearance and his mother's unforgiveness, making an impossible choice he believed was right, only to be vilified for it. And for my mother, who had lived with this secret, watching the silent drama unfold next door, desperate to protect her own family from its shadow. "You should have told me," I whispered. The words choked with emotion. "You should have trusted me. I deserved to know my grandmother. She deserved to know me. We could have tried to heal it." The "we" was a heavy admission of my own earlier indifference, my own failure to look beyond the surface. My father pushed himself up from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He came to me, kneeling awkwardly beside my chair, his hand reaching for mine, his touch frail but firm. "I know, Mary. I know. And I am so, so sorry. It was a coward's choice, born of shame and despair. I lost my brother, and then I lost my mother. And I was terrified of losing you, of that bitterness poisoning your beautiful life. I wanted to protect you from the ugliness of our past, and instead, I denied you a grandmother, and denied Eleanor a chance at peace." His confession, raw and unfiltered, broke something open inside me. The years of silence, the carefully constructed facade, crumbled, revealing the profound human vulnerability beneath. There was no villain here, only broken people trying to survive, making choices they believed were best, with devastating consequences. "I can't imagine," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "what it must have been like for her. To live next door, watching me, knowing she was my grandmother, and never being able to say it. The image of her delicate script, her observations of my life, her wistful notes about my children now took on a new, heart-wrenching meaning. Every good morning had been a silent scream, every lovely day a yearning for connection. David, who had remained a silent, supportive presence throughout this painful unveiling, finally spoke, his voice gentle. "What about the inheritance, Robert? The money Thomas was supposed to get?" My father shook his head. "It's still there, untouched. I never considered it mine. It's meant for Thomas's legacy. For something good, something meaningful. I always hoped one day someone might figure out what that was." And in that moment, a new purpose began to form within me, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. Eleanor, my grandmother, had silently lived her life next door, attempting to reclaim a connection. My father had carried the burden of guilt and an untouched inheritance. Perhaps I thought it was now my turn to reclaim something. To reclaim Eleanor's story, Thomas's memory, and the fractured pieces of my family's past, and perhaps, finally, use that legacy for the good my grandmother had always intended. The conversation that followed was long and arduous, spanning hours, unraveling decades of pain and misunderstanding. It was a dialogue filled with tears, regrets, and hesitant attempts at understanding. My parents shared old photographs of a young, vibrant Eleanor, a lively Thomas, and a carefree Robert before the shadows descended. They spoke of the happy memories, the holidays, the ordinary joys that had been eclipsed by the tragedy. Leaving my parents' house that evening, the weight on my chest was still immense, but it was different now. It was the weight of truth, not of ignorance. The suburban streetlights, which once seemed to cast an innocent glow, now felt like silent observers of a profoundly complicated world. In the days and weeks that followed, the revelations continued to unfold. I went back to Eleanor's house, this time not as a curious neighbor or a dutiful assistant, but as a granddaughter. Sarah, the social worker, was understanding when I explained the need to go through everything with a more personal lens. I meticulously went through her belongings, each item now a clue, a piece of the puzzle of her life. I found old letters, carefully preserved, from Thomas to Eleanor, filled with youthful hopes and later his struggles. I found meticulously kept financial records, showing that Eleanor had lived a frugal life, always aware of the trust fund, but never seeking it for herself. Her reclamation, I realized, had truly been about love, truth, and reconciliation, not material wealth. I discovered that the small ceramic bowl in her entryway wasn't just filled with dried flowers. Nestled beneath them was a delicate silver locket. Inside, two tiny, faded photographs, one of a young woman with kind eyes, unmistakably Eleanor, and the other, a bright-eyed young man, Thomas. It was a poignant symbol of the two people she held closest to her heart, the two she had lost in different, equally agonizing ways. Eleanor's will, when it was finally found tucked into a hidden compartment of her writing desk, was simple and stark. It left everything, all her worldly possessions, to Mary, the daughter of Robert. No mention of her son Robert or his wife, my mother. It was a final, bittersweet acknowledgement, a gesture of love towards me, but a continued, painful silence towards my father. And in a separate envelope, a handwritten note, dated just days before she passed. My dearest Mary, the elegant script read, "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and perhaps you have found the truth. I watched you grow, my darling, and your laughter, your kindness, your diligent spirit, they brought me solace. You are so much like my Thomas, and my heart longed to hold you, to tell you everything. But some wounds run too deep, and my pride, my sorrow, held me captive. Forgive me, if you can, for my silence. I wanted to reclaim a piece of my family, a piece of Thomas, through you. Now it falls to you to reclaim our truth, and to finally use Thomas's legacy for the good it was always meant to be. Live fearlessly, my granddaughter, and love fiercely." The tears streamed down my face, washing away years of unasked questions, of assumed realities. My grandmother had left me a task, a legacy of truth and love. The untouched trust fund my father had mentioned became my focus. After many discussions with David and my parents, and a deep dive into legal documents, we established a foundation in Thomas's name, dedicated to supporting young artists struggling with mental health challenges. It was a reclamation of sorts, a way to transform past tragedy into future hope, a way to honor both Thomas's artistic spirit and Eleanor's unspoken desire for healing. The relationship with my parents began a long, difficult process of reconstruction. Forgiveness was not a sudden burst of light, but a slow, arduous journey through shadowed valleys. There were still moments of hurt, of anger, of profound sadness for what was lost. But now there was also understanding, empathy, and an honest reckoning with the messy, imperfect humanity of my family. My father, relieved of his decades-long secret, slowly began to heal, the burden visibly lifting from his shoulders. My mother, too, found a quiet peace in the truth finally being out in the open. Eleanor's house, after much thought, was sold. But not before I spent countless hours there, walking through its perfectly ordered rooms, tending to her vibrant petunias and rereading her journal. Each visit was a conversation with her spirit, a silent apology, and a renewed commitment to live with an open heart. I kept the journal, the locket, and Thomas's sketch. They were not just mementos. They were sacred texts, reminders of the hidden complexities of human lives and the profound importance of genuine connection. I learned to look at my own life, my own neighbors, my own family with new eyes. The carefully maintained, unspoken boundaries of neighborly politeness were still there. But now I understood them as potentially fragile veneers beneath which entire universes of hopes, fears, and unspoken stories might reside. I started to make small, deliberate gestures of connection, a plate of cookies for a new family, A longer chat with an elderly man down the street, an invitation for coffee to a struggling single mother. The gaping, unforgivable hole in my own humanity. That chilling realization from the day Eleanor's body was carried away was slowly, painfully being mended. It wasn't about erasing the past or achieving perfect forgiveness, but about acknowledging the wounds, understanding their origins, and choosing to live with greater empathy and truth. I often sit on my porch now, watching the world go by, just as Eleanor once did. I tend my roses, no longer just a dedicated gardener, but a woman keenly aware of the silent gazes that might be observing her. Sometimes I imagine Eleanor next door, watching me, and I whisper, "I know now, Grandma. I know." And in that whisper, there's not just sorrow, but a profound sense of peace. The truth, however devastating, had indeed brought peace, not perfection. It had brought a shattered, but ultimately stronger sense of self, a deeper understanding of love, loss, and the enduring power of family, even the family we never knew we had. The vibrant petunias in Eleanor's old garden, which I still tended, bloomed brighter each year, a testament to life, resilience, and the enduring hope that even the most deeply buried secrets can eventually bring forth beauty.